Susan Gardner here from Municipal World. We're at the 2019 Ontario Municipal Administrators Association Fall Workshop. Joining me in the Municipal World Media Center is Diane Kalen-Sukra, Municipal World columnist and author of the book Save Your City. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Susan. Pleased to be here.
Such a delight to have you in to chat. You just did an amazing keynote here at OMA, and I wanted to chat a little bit about this theme of toxic behavior, toxic culture, how it's manifesting itself in our communities. Tell us what you've heard.
Well, we are here speaking with the Municipal Administrators of Ontario, but what they're reporting and their experience with toxic culture is actually not unique across Canada. It seems to be a nationwide problem, and not only, of course, just in Canada, but in the United States, United Kingdom, in fact, a global problem. So what we're looking at specifically is how toxic culture and incivility and its rising nature everywhere is impacting local governments specifically. And what we looked at today is some of the coping mechanisms that we've been using to try and address it in local government. So for instance, to a large extent, we've been like frogs in a tepid pot of water over the past 20 years that's been slowly being brought to a boil. And we've adopted many different coping mechanisms to address the rising incivility, but it's really imperative that we understand that those are just coping mechanisms, so they don't actually address the fundamental problem of toxic culture. So to give some examples, we began looking at resilience or personal well-being, mindfulness. These are all important emotional management and personal management skills. However, they have limitations in terms of their application, because as the temperature rises in toxic environments, it may be advisable for your personal well-being and sanity to actually remove yourself from those situations. So it's important, but limited in its application, because even resilience requires us to build healthy connections, and healthy connections cannot be built in climates of mistrust and animosity. So then we looked at some of the legal coping mechanisms, which were highlighted very much so in this conference, around the use of integrity commissioners, the importance of codes of conduct. We see new legislation around WorkSafe, and we see some municipalities, not so much in Ontario, but in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and heavily so in the United States, adopting municipal anti-bylaws to deal with this rising animosity among neighbors in the community.
So if we dial this back to the source, what's the cause of this rise in incivility? I mean, I think there's no question that we're experiencing it. People are reporting it. We've got these. How did this? What's happened here?
Sure, I think there's a few fundamental causes. The first one being that the breaking of the social contract. What we grew up in terms of anticipating about jobs and opportunities and prosperity, the type of relations and communities we would live in, and our standards of living have been fundamentally shifted because of globalization, the tectonic shifts in our economy, the displacement of people, communities, and industries, and limited sort of ability to address that. And so that's created a lot of the fear and despair and confusion without a type of program for how we're going to go. We've gone from a full employment to kind of gig economy. Well, that's an entirely different thing, while affordability rises and instability increases. So that's a fundamental problem. But then to top it off, we have rising individualism and consumerism, and this barrage of cultural influences that don't really support the democratic ethos, the kind that requires us to love our neighbor, put the interests of others ahead of our own. And this is an impediment to good governance and sustainable community building. And in addition to that, there's been a decline in the quality and level of our civic education. So a lot of the challenges that our municipalities are actually facing, which is kind of like a tsunami of challenges, from infrastructure to limited revenue to climate change mitigation, adaptation, downloading of services, increasing complexities, uncertain global market, demographic uncertainties, and the list goes on. We now have the mental illness and the social isolation and the opioid crisis. It just doesn't seem to end, and yet there is very little public understanding of what our municipal officials, politicians, and staff are actually facing and what it's going to require. It's going to require mass collaboration, innovation, and the rebuilding of trust and understanding amongst ourselves to kind of like take back our communities, to understand that we all belong, and to weave back that social fabric to build healthy, resilient, safe, and inclusive communities for all. Major undertaking, very exciting, but it requires us to actually understand understand the risk that toxic culture poses to our communities, and find ways to foster the type of culture that can support good governance, sustainable community building, and ultimately our democracy, which is really what's at threat today.
So, communities that want to be proactive and serious about addressing these issues, turning back to being healthy communities, eliminating this toxicity. How do they do this? What are you suggesting? What's the solution?
Well, it is a complex and multifaceted process, but it begins from the heart, and it begins from our own direct spheres of influence. And we all have a different sphere of influence. It begins in the home, it extends to our workplaces, to our work in the public sphere, and local governments, again, have a unique role to play in terms of the policies they implement, the behaviors that they accept or don't accept. We need political leadership. We need up standards. We need the fostering of the kind of courage and civic values and outspokenness in the face of this toxicity in order to begin to address it. But on top of that, there are very practical things. And in the book, in Save Your City, and partially we address this in the keynote today, there is a process of transition from what I call bullyville to sustainable, the sustainable kind of culture that we require to make these kinds of changes. And some of what we're seeing, like I give a lot of examples of concrete examples of what people are doing today. There is actually a kind of underground civic revival taking place in many different pockets, and it's important that we share some of those examples. Some of the most important ones include municipalities being involved again in civic education. And we see some municipalities, particularly in the States, but we also have the City of Edmonton and Calgary doing some civic education with youth. But there are some programs for adults that are like 8-week intensive municipal education programs. So we don't arrive in this situation every election where we're reinventing the wheel, where we're reestablishing what democracy and good governance and actually means. But it's going to take, cultural change is a difficult process within organizations. It can take as short as 5 years with concerted leadership and effort. Community change can take a generation, so up to 30 years. And so that's a challenge, but together, and this is why I really appreciated the conference theme that we had today of we're all in this together, is that foundational cornerstone of community building, of social unity on the things that matter. And the things that matter is that this is a democracy where we're all worthy of equal respect, opportunity, trust, and rights. And we have got to support, in order to enforce it, we've got to support the well-being of all and foster the kind of ethos, the kind of spirit that wishes our neighbor well. And I think certainly there's an enormous amount of will on behalf of our CAOs. And this week I've been on tour speaking to other municipal officials. And it's the sentiment is universal, that we need to, we're on one ship with one destiny, and we've got to cooperate. And that involves a revival of civic education and civic values to restore our democracy and build our sustainable future.
We somehow got here independently through, navigating on our own. To get out of here, we're going to have to go together.
Yes, that's exactly right. We're on one ship. Yep.
Yeah.
One destiny.
So take a minute to talk about the book,
Yes.
Save Your City. It's available on books.municipalworld.com.
That's right. And the Municipal World Edition has a foreword by George Cuff, and as well as a workbook. So a lot of municipalities are ordering it for their mayors and councillors, but also for their frontline staff, particularly those that are engaging with the public, because it's part of that renewal of understanding. It's not okay anymore to work in a municipality for 20 years and only be aware of that particular facet of what you're doing. Employees are citizens first, and our local governments are hugely influential. In many communities, they are the largest employer. And again, it begins with our sphere of influence. We have an enormous amount of influence within our local governments to raise the consciousness, raise the awareness, and it begins with how we treat each other every day.
It's fantastic. It's a great book, and I hope people will pick it up. Save Your City. Thank you so much, Diane, for coming in.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure chatting.
Indeed. Yes.
Susan Gardner here from Municipal World with Diane Kalen-Sukra. We share your stories.